Truly, as my teacher used to say, music compositions are good travel companion on the path of life. When you're told those things, you're usually young, in my case, even a child. You don't foresee this because you live in your time and you're young, forever young. And the music is discovered and forever new. Of course, you realize that it existed before you, but so many people play, think, teach, write about, edit publications of the different source materials of the score to bring out the thought of the composer so that the interpretation then disconnected in time periods from its original time frame, not to say the least instrumental evolution, length of sound compared to decay, concert projection of holes in size or electronic recording systems. In other words, whatever the evolution of the awareness of the intricacies and the subtleties or the breaking points with tradition, which in this case Beethoven in Sonata Opus 110 did, also within a tradition which he received as the Haydn early Vienna first school of composition, as we call it today, defined the sonata form. So a major tonality principal key sonata, in this case A flat major, towards the coda into the development in between recap. Has to have a surprise, quote unquote, as he was taught by Haydn, flat six tonality call, which is sort of a minor appoggiatura of the dominant before you finish in major. Now, Beethoven didn't approach this scholastically only, because obviously he bathed in the whole Viennese school and culture, which was beyond Haydn, but we attribute this to this tradition where they started observing that form of the two-theme development recap. And then the organization of the thought process of pure music in a string quartet without lyrics, meaning for pure voice leading in piano texture, which is technically vertical because the two hands have to match with a single brain organizing or divided into several layers of follow-up of thoughts. Whenever a string quartet is four brains through the eight hands, each of which, a pair of which, is organized in a system to produce a single beautiful sound in intonation. And therefore those four, sometimes of course with double stops, parts, just like an SATB chorus from the Renaissance onwards, we're bringing this harmonization through the layered voicing. And intuitively, because the string quartet was the, I would say, signature form for a classical era composer, the piano sonatas, which Beethoven started composing at the dawn of the fortepiano in the late 1790s, forgive me, into 1827 when he died. So roughly the first 30 years of the 19th century, he conceived about 27 piano sonatas. But, well, 32 in 27 years, that's what I thought the numbers didn't match in my brain. But what I meant to compel us here to understand is that the people who were listening to these works composed in their own time in Vienna, for instance, were highly educated musicians, if not noblemen with enough time to spend into awareness in art forms, painting, poetry, literature, language, and music. So the amateur, literally lover of, and the professionals who had to earn their living from service to the muse were embarked in an economy where the ones were sponsoring the others, and therefore music making in the therefore wealthy but highly, not always together going, educated in music patrons then were encouraging the composers away from only their only option of financial survival, which is to be attached to a court, to a prince, where they were just submitting daily music for consumption, from spiritual to entertainment, and therefore providing what today we have in recorded form, freshly composed. So inevitably, in industrial quantities, they didn't renew their style or think about having the opportunity to even imagine such thing, to question the tonality as a system that they inherited. It was partly survival, partly fitting the best capacity of producing this quality music in order to be liked and hired, and only the few among them made it. So therefore, to be having patrons like Waldstein and Razumovsky were opportunities for composers like Beethoven to literally have time to compose and rethink, or if not the status quo of the time, but follow the intuition, the strong intuition of the revolution. We consider it evolution, probably not them in their own time, obviously. And therefore, the fact that Beethoven was composing for this new instrument, which characterizes its expression mainly, but not solely, through dynamic range contrast. Fortepiano, the name of the instrument, it's an Italian name after Cristofori's invention, and so on. It's not harpsichord music inherited that is playable on fortepiano, as it's the case for Johann Christian Bach sonatas, as is the case for Haydn sonatas before the later ones in London on the Broadwood piano, but also the Steins already in Vienna, which he played on. And there is an evolution, because Haydn lived until 1809, Beethoven died in 1827. Of course, Mozart died young in 1791, so there was an interruption in the filiation Haydn-Mozart that would never existed with Beethoven in terms of musical inheritance. But nevertheless, Vienna was producing its traditional music production, and until the Romantic era, as we call it now, of course, that followed briefly after Bach's death in 1750, and not supposedly end of Baroque, but it wasn't announced to them, and the fall of the Roman Empire took time, but those who were then didn't realize it so much. Everything is in transitions. Not everything is in necessarily breakages. But it is fascinating to observe how in time period all this was relatively brief, even if for unfortunate situations of hygiene of life and medical lack of today's progress in their eyes, people lived shortly compared to us today in general, and not in particular, and depends where in the world. So this kind of idea that we don't have time to study, we have to produce, was that we imitated what the predecessors did, and then we added our grain of salt, the genius of melodic lines like Mozart and Schubert, of course, with polyphony, but also by immersion in its own time period. They didn't come out of nowhere, and brought in so much influence, like Haydn on them, and they on Beethoven, and Beethoven on the others. And then the Romantic era starts with it's obviously already translated into it by Beethoven's late works, like the Third Sonata for cello and onwards with the symphonies. And all this is a continuum, but nevertheless, what we call Romantic era, where the composers like Schumann, Chopin, Liszt, Mendelssohn, who were born, the four of them, between 1809 and 1811. And so they sort of overlapped, they did, in time periods. But managed to go from the Baroque to the what we call classical form, and then breaking partly of the form and the expression within the form to go into what we call today Romantic expression of music, which is to do with literature and painting and the very individualism that came after the French Revolution. And then the different ways of organizing societal evolution for the expression of human condition through art, through science, through, of course, military development. And all this was part of the industry as well. The instruments became stronger, bigger, projecting longer, projecting more people to hear it. And there are music schools that developed, that Mendelssohn created and founded. The Leipzig one about 100 years after Bach's birth, or death rather, in 1750, in the middle of the 1850s. And then you had Schumann's wife's father, who had his own private famous school, Mr. Wieck. And so you had more and more students who played more and more instrument. And so there was a development from the art form that covered church and court to bourgeoisie, and therefore individual Age of Enlightenment, different Masonic lodges, and Mozart already composed for them, Beethoven too, and then it goes into the organization of the city-states, into country nations, and then the nationalistic, of course, not only military and historic, ethnically, and in all aspects, the music tradition of the area geographically, historically, and religiously as well for some, became the identity of these newly identified countries after there were regions of empires which fell apart. And until Schoenberg, at the end of the falling apart of the main European which covered more than Europe, three empires, the Russian, Ottoman, and the Prussian, he decided that, and fell, and was compelled, and his great genius, of course, doesn't have to have an explanation why, but there was a necessity to break the tonal system that was in fact inherited by this organization for centuries in Western Europe, that brings us to think of classical repertoire as German by essence, because we don't call it German, or in the Germanic countries of Mitteleuropa, that goes from before Bach until therefore Schoenberg and Hindemith. And then you have French, and then English, and then Italian, and then Spanish, which we still call by their countries, and of course the Czech and the Polish, and these national schools, which were Russian as well, attached to the tradition of notation of music with the tonal system of the harmonic progressions and the contrapuntal tradition that was developed from the Renaissance onwards, to attach their individual roots in their areas of the world with sort of on the bandwagon of classical music that was really Bach, Beethoven, Schumann, Brahms, without to bypass Wagner and Liszt and so many more, Schubert, Mendelssohn, at least Germanic speaking. And to a certain extent, that can be said that the nationalism in music came because of this evolution from empires, regions, or small feudalities earlier. Beethoven was German, but he grew up in Vienna as a musician because that was the center of music. The centrifuge was Vienna. And Mozart came from Salzburg, okay, but it was not yet Austria, even if it is, from close up. And nevertheless, Vienna created this incredible beehive of musical thriving. And Beethoven, in many aspects, for me and for most of us who are teaching, playing, loving, catering, cherishing these repertoires, is a present music, not as a museum music to the coming generations, beyond the tradition of interpretation of our already early predecessors before World War II or even before World War I, the students of Liszt or the students of Liszt, and so on. And so the traditions of how we follow the understanding through which editions, which editor from Schnabel and through others, rejecting or accepting, analyzing it in one way or the other. Of course, the intuition, the real word probably for intuition is gift. Then that comes to a certain divinity idea. But let's say that if we are by ear pre-selected with a so-called perfect pitch, which again, naming the notes doesn't mean that you feel them, understand them, or have a connection to them. After all, it's like words. They vehicle thoughts. That's what the symbols of them are, even if they have beautiful sounds by themselves, poetically spoken in each language. To have the perfect pitch, to hear all the notes, doesn't mean that because you can name them by ear, instead of only through the eyes and then connecting them to the pitch. And same thing with the instruments where you don't have keyboards, therefore you have to search for the intonation. Then you create an ear that is, in fact, taught to be either by intervals or with a fixed awareness of a tone towards which you refer all the other intervals, so you can have this relative pitch, or you can have, for the sake of the instrument that you play or the voice that you sing, obviously your own, how you organize the awareness of the pitch class and the tone, and how they organize the semitones and then eventually the quarter tones, and how you organize the syntax of the musical phrase with or without, especially when there are no lyrics, how you organize the grammar awareness of the harmonic progressions within the syntax of the narrative storytelling, because after all, even if there are no lyrics, and it's called pure music, there are storytellings that are psychologically insinuated into the listener. That the listener picks them or not, that's another story. And to which extent they do, that's also how much they're educated into an awareness. In other words, you cannot read a book unless you're alphabetized in the language in which it's written. And so then you cannot just read it by the sounds of it, even if they're very appealing, like a mother tongue is learned by ear because the sounds are appealing and the child reproduces them. So therefore, we start by imitating before we start reflecting, by being able to think by reading, and therefore by writing our own readings for others to do. And define the world that we more or less understand from the invisible or the visible, and organize myths and give us capacities of supernatural elevation, so that some artworks mean more than only what they are: a painting, a sculpture, a poetry, a sound of a word or a sound of a composition, a tension, a release, a dissonance, a consonance. All these things, of course, are rooted in their time period. And when you take them out of it into ours, then either we use it as a memory lane museum reproduction of how it's supposed to have been played, therefore how it's supposed to have been understood or heard, and therefore how it's supposed to have been eventually analyzed, if they had time to analyze. But of course, they learned quickly the skills more than the analytical awareness, because again of time constraints, probably, I assume, between Mendelssohn or Schubert and Weber, people who died in their 30s, like Mozart also, and Chopin, well, late 30s. You could argue that they didn't bring us the fruit of the development of their, what today we would call wisdom and old age experience, and therefore the fruit of all what they are and represent as a treasure of humanity, while a hyphen between their predecessors and today for us to receive from them. So that in all this path of life, which is relatively short compared to the path of the world, an artwork outside of its context, beyond the art historian who explains it to you in music, you reach the point as a pianist, and that's what I do when I teach pianists for so many decades now, is what it is that we're supposed to bring out, or what it is that we're supposed to think, because pulse, rhythm, tempo, those are concepts that are related, but not necessarily dictating each other. Even in objective terms, after the 1815 commercial existence of the appearance, rather, of the metronome by Melzel in Vienna, for which, by the way, Beethoven didn't retroactively mark those factual beats a minute, objective tempo markings that we could refer to as his will, how to be played. For his symphonies, he didn't do so for most of his sonatas. So again, we are then left with the guessing between the choice of the meter and the indication with the Italian words, or in German, the moderato and the cantabile and the espressivo and whatever, like in opening of 110. But then what really matters is when we play, how do we express through our playing all this filtered, learned, intuitively guessed by the gift or intuition, the acquired awareness of all what that means to us, or it's supposed to mean to us. And how does it filter through ourselves individually to share it with an audience, live or recorded, or to even try to understand not why Beethoven didn't do this or could have done that, besides having access to some of his manuscripts and sketches. In terms of absolute direction of arch phrasing, direction of a line, music is a science, but organized on the soulful experience with a meaning to translate the psychological experience of human experience on life, on earth, with its desire of elevation and its reality of sufferance, joys, hopes, disappointments, love, expectations, anxieties, or exaltations, which are part of the human nature that are expressed in theater or plays, in paintings, in films, in all the narratives of the human experience in which we identify more or less, because obviously it's easier to identify closer to our time frame than to time frames that are so far away from ours that accept the essence of the human experience, love, death, eros, thanatos, as would say the Greeks, which are the great unknowns or the great hopes or the great fears and the great strides to go towards. The rest is really in its own time frame. And so when I go back to the Beethoven 110 Sonata opening and the student is playing it, they come from a score that is published from which they trust that by playing all the notes and the rhythms and possibly the indications by words and phrasings, if they take them all in account, to which extent their technique will allow to have the touch control to realize it, then how much they're aware of the rest of the compositions of Beethoven. How did he orchestrate his symphonies? How did he organize the voices in his string quartets? So by the time they have to immerse themselves in these other idioms of the same composer's mind that flourishes and blossoms in different genres and styles even within his own life, that happens for some of the composers. Not all, of course, depends how long they lived as well. But that's not the point. The point is that I find that when we are only related to the score gives us some markings that we have to bring alive. And then we have the traditions and the predecessors who recorded before us. And so we have guidelines. We know that it's supposed to be this or that. But when it comes down to play it yourself or try it yourself, of course, you ask for counsel, you ask for advice from teachers that you hopefully trust. But why should you trust them? After all, you have access to so many recordings. You can also make a critical compilation of how they saw it, and the pulse and the tempo versus the phrasing and the touch and the articulation, the voicing and the pedaling and the harmonizing compared to the expression of the piece, and eventually the mystery of what does it mean. I find it extremely awakening to teach a student a piece which I rediscover when the student discovers it, let's say after a few weeks or a month, and I was on it for the last 4 or 5 decades. But in front of the fact that we need to harness what it means to us beyond only what it meant to the composer, if we can reach to that level of hearing, understanding of the usage of the tradition, of how he broke from the tradition or how he didn't. Did he use that flat 6 at the end of the first movement to finish the coda before the coda of the sonata, of the principal major key format? Okay, these are factual little things that you can observe. And when you play them, how much do you have to put them in a meaning? How much by themselves? A modulation by itself creates a color change. therefore an orchestral instrumental group by its beautiful original and different from each other timbre, brings us to understand that there is a psychological reason intellectually as well for which a composer chose the melodic line to be the clarinet or the oboe, or the strings are interrupted in their build-up of crescendo by brass entering piano or sustaining the harmony with the French horns, and then have a secondary voice through a woodwind instrument. Because on the piano, we only play the piano. We don't play other instruments in terms of timbre of tone. But we do have, because of the forte and the piano, the capacity to obtain what is chiaroscuro, as the Italians, the effect of the shadow and the light. So you can bring that in perspective, almost in 3D in the texture. And you add to it the subtlety of the articulation, the breathing between the elements of the sentence, or how the sentence is structured syntaxically that doesn't correspond to the bars because they're randomly there most of the time, but the phrase is way beyond overlapping. And I think that the students end up by having an idea, not only by imitating, but also by understanding, either because you help them visualize elements, either because you think, after all, it's an open garden to be visited by each of us and see what we perceive in it, from the scientific level to the spiritually elevating level of the creation itself. And you can also organize this, which are not contradictory for most of us, with also your personal experience in this garden, how you met somebody, how you loved perhaps, how you were left alone in this garden, and perhaps you have childhood memories that you want to revisit, or perhaps you have terrible memories of it. So your little story within the great story of the storytelling of the piece. And so your experience within the great experience, of course, in humility, you melt into the music itself that you serve, the muse itself. But you still have to go through your path of discovery and approximation and possibly success in some aspects, because the criteria are not defined objectively. They're only defined by this or that teacher and tradition and schooling, and whose rubato is too much or not enough, and whose ritenuto is tasteless or tasteful, is defined by who defines the taste. And so thankfully, perhaps, ultimately for us teachers, no matter how defined the score is in its notation, it leaves room for interpretation in between the notes. Literally, translation as interpretation means it. And to which extent then interpretation can allow improvisation is part of it, or out of it line, or in some traditions in the past it was expected, today not. Do you choose in which tradition you place yourself, by conviction or by provocation, or by both? I think it's a mesmerizing time that we have the time to revisit the music of the past, from its inception to its conception to its understanding of how to be delivered, shared, and agree to disagree, and have opinions about how it's supposed to have been expected to be done. I'm also part of this people who have opinions, because without which you cannot play a piece or compose a piece or choose to leave a trace of your opinion on a work, which of course is bigger than us when you make an interpretation. But during the time you speak it, you say it, you think it, you you organize it like a blueprint of an architecture that doesn't exist but in your imagination. Through your playing, you send the GPS signs of the structure of the piece according to how you organize the phrasing and the groupment of bars that reach a structured phrasing, which is not only analytical on paper or on today's screen, but also embedded in your playing, so that you play not only what you already heard or guessed or you were inspired by, or because you like it so, or because you like how your teacher told you, or because you dislike the way the teacher told you so. And why not? All this is part of how you develop your own personality that expresses this music because it means to you so much that you want to play it at the closest to what it means to you. Before you define what it does mean to you, then you define how you're going to play it. And that's what piano teaching is so fascinating for me, is to help a student play it at the best of their understanding. But you have to give them the tools to find their understanding, while you give them the tools to find how to play their understanding. In other words, to shape the stylistic contours of the work, to make them able to open their horizon so that they can explore at different levels what they perhaps didn't perceive at the first reading or second reading of the piece, because there is so much when these masterpieces keep on giving for every generation, that one is confronted to one's own humility about what did I really understand in the piece compared to what this young person understands already, perhaps without knowing how or why. And then I think it's a fascinating exchange. It's not a one-way, asymmetrical pouring of experience and knowledge into intuition in order to shape it or perhaps even format it. That's terrible for me. The idea of training a musician, to me, it's not training a dog to obey to get a reward. It's really, like Mademoiselle Boulanger used to do, is to build the capacity, give the tools, intellectual and technical, to each person who wants to understand what it means to them to understand the piece, and therefore how to best play it or conduct it or analyze it or whatever they do with this work, in the meaning of it, in the history of art, and how they place themselves in the meaning of it all. It sounds probably, when I speak all these different aspects, layers of this endeavor to structure and organize the creativity or harness it to a certain extent of a young student, instead of just saying, okay, first let's learn the notes, then let's learn the piece, and then let's see later what it could mean to us. We'll add a layer of interpretation because we heard it somewhere or somebody convinced us, and then we can always exchange it later with another one. That's an approach which is very pragmatic, or as well as immerse yourself in the oeuvre of the composer in its time period, historically and politically and economically and philosophically, therefore, to understand how come that is the mindset of the time and how they expressed this mindset in either most of them to get out of it and free from its boundaries, because somewhere the art form connects us to something that is so mysterious that also guides us or calls us. And when we share it, we feel like it's a language, not an escapism. Well, in some cases it is not only a entertainment, as most people treat music today, but necessarily as well, especially if it's related to images for storytelling through films or games or whatever. Music is a psychological food for thought that brings us to react or to enhance our awareness and understanding of the storytelling, though in the silence of a single reader with a book, you could generate your own unnotated and never to be notated music, as you can imagine the unpainted paintings, or you can imagine the characters like no actor can really embody them, because you idealize them as you think they are, because somehow the dimension of the heroes of the storytelling mythologically are bigger than their representation. In the sense, not bigger, but in the sense of the dimensions that they bring to our awareness and understanding, and our humor and our reflection and our desire to be embarked in their music world, through which we understand, in fact, it's almost like visiting a country in the past or in the present, or who knows, perhaps in the future, when we enter in the music world of a composer's language. It takes time. It's not just on the surface of reciting the notes correctly at the best, and it's already by itself a great endeavor, but not an end by itself. While because of the variety of repertoires, time periods that we cover in teaching, and even with a long expectation of life, if we are curious in the genuine sense of the word, to learn about all the repertoires of all the time periods, with all the genres and all the styles, and try to figure out, well, no, there's no way. None of them did, as a matter of fact, in their own times. They dealt with the music of their time, the poetry of their time. They had awareness of the music and the poetry and the painting of the past, not as extended as us, because of our capacity today to explore in depth niches of distant past cultures. I think they would have dreamed of it. But they were immersed in their dailiness. And in fact, if you probably had asked Beethoven with this Sonata, Opus 110, what would be played 250 or 300 years after you, he might have perhaps said Beethoven of the day. And that leaves us a little speechless, right? Because how come? Because of conserving, that means preserving a tradition, we learn the music of the 19th, 18th, 17th, 16th, 15th, 14th, etc. centuries. We live with them, we thrive in them, we create our own bubble in which we feel like this is where we belong, is in our awareness and knowledge, and then that's how we have much more knowledge about so many layers of time periods of past, of history of humanity than they had in their own. And perhaps in a way, being overly aware of so much, overly capable of exploring, makes us aware of the fact that we will never get enough time for all of it. So might as well go to the fact of just playing that piece today that way, and then see where we go from there. That's why weekly, daily teaching is about solving short-term progress, mid-term projects, exam, jury, recital, audition, job, graduation, second job, etc. And then long-term, how do I fit, not by the ego, but by the service to the muse, in through the trade, through the awareness of what it represents that I'm doing. Of course, when you're very young and you start the piano before you're 4 or 5, you don't have to question yourself those things, thank God. But perhaps you do intuitively, but we cannot translate it in words because we cannot form the thoughts in words or texts. Perhaps ultimately it's better to take the time to, when we have the opportunity, to revisit what by intuition we loved so much and we understand more about it, or some things that we rejected at the get-go because it was a foreign language to us or something that we felt like didn't correspond to what we liked in this art form. And then we develop the taste for it later, the acquired taste. And then it leads to open doors to other intellectual connections that brings us to aesthetic awarenesses of dimensions that we haven't foreseen in the intuitive drive of the youth, where the adults watch the child prodigy, and I was one, so I can speak in person of the point of view of where I was, when I was, that situation was then. They were sort of amused or terrified by the fact that by untold awareness of knowledge, you can render a piece as if you've gone through sufferance, knowledge of love and loss, God, and whatever it represents, the meaning of meditation or the expression of emotion that you haven't lived because you've just arrived on earth. But somehow you're able, either through your eyes as a painter, ears as a musician, and imagination, and perhaps scary amount of imagination, to elaborate very early in your life. People say, oh, Mozart wrote this as a child besides himself, or because he copied it from somewhere, or his father wrote it and he copied it. People made fun of this, even of me at my small level compared to him. Father was nicknamed Leopold Naoumoff. But I know what it is to compose. It's almost like when I was a child. I mean, it was almost rediscovering something that I have heard far distant in time and which I try to retrieve. But I'm not totally sure. And I follow that instinct, like when you try to remember a dream when you wake up and only little pieces of it come back to you, and you realize that if you can connect the dots, you can go further back into it, and then you can build the narrative of it. Well, that's how I felt about composition, not as something that I make up, but something I retrieve. Or when I was practicing as a child, the children piano pieces from the books to learn how to play piano, I felt like when it finished, I needed more. It sounds awkward, but it's true. Not more technical piano torture, more scales, more thirds, more octaves, more sixths, more pain, more boredom of repetitive practicing, because obviously when you're alone, let less a child, you want, like all mammals, want to connect to each other and play and interact. That's what it's the humanity. But to spend hours in front of an instrument and not seeing the purpose of it because the progress is so distant that you don't realize that you even observe it or cannot even be aware of it when you're a child. You just do it to obey, to please parents, teachers, and whoever. And so they look at you like, oh my God, he knows already, in my case, so much about it. But that doesn't mean much, because when you grow up, this intuition evaporates in many aspects. You stop believing in Santa and you might be disappointed about it, childish level. But then what do you replace your intuition with? Knowledge? Is it because you go into a great analysis class of Nadia Boulanger, and Mademoiselle tells you that this tonality leads to this, which meant that, and this enharmonic modulation creates this effect, and what does it mean by, and then ultimately said, it only means what itself the music says. It's its own language. Instead of explaining it, you just play it. But to play it, you have to understand it. So it's one of those egg and the hen situation. And because you can, through the intuition, bypass that stage of things. Of course, you cannot do it as an opera singer when you're a child, because physically it's impossible. You cannot perhaps configure a four-voice fugue unless you learn and see how fugues are done, but you can come up with a melodic line. And perhaps the simplicity and the beauty of poetic beauty of simplicity is as meaningful as the complexity of an art form or a scientific form or whatever it is. You always come down to the level of what this storytelling, narrative construction generates in me psychologically, either because I can receive it or I can't. Because I listen to a beautiful love poem in a foreign language, I don't know if it's an insult or love. I only listen to the sounds. Therefore, as I said earlier, when you put meaning in the sounds, you listen to the meaning more to the sounds. And when you put more meaning than sounds, then you start organizing your thoughts. When you think you're organizing your thoughts, you see how Beethoven organized his in the sonata. And when you play it, then you play his thoughts organization. And you start thinking, but what if he didn't like that? And my teacher used to say to me when I used to observe those things, like all of us when we discover it, says, try to play like he wrote it rather in how you wish he did, and write your own separately. And if you don't, then play what he wrote, but meaningfully. Put yourself in understanding what it means. And many times when I teach, I realize that students make a misread note, a misreading, a misguessing, which I call it so, because their intuition was overriding their reading capacity, either because there was a missing courtesy accidental, regardless the reason. For a week or so before a lesson, they played it one way through that section with that note, and then I have to reveal it to them at the lesson that, while it sounds plausible, possibly good, and I can continuously develop certain way of thematizing their mistake, nevertheless, it's wrong. The composer chose this, the publisher published that. Hopefully corresponds to the composer's manuscript. And of course, between manuscripts and copies and handwritten copies in the past, even Chopin at least 3 times copying his pieces for 3 publishers, embedded things that are detailed differently, didn't perhaps matter to him because he improvised them and played them and taught them and people played him. But perhaps we today trust that the source is the source and the material is the translation of the intent of the composer, and that we're supposed to, from the signs on the page, we're supposed to bring all this universe that was created by this composer's imagination and this composer's recollection of his own, or this composer's aesthetic exploration, or, as I said, breaking with its own time, which to us escapes us because obviously the audacities of the past escapes us today in every aspect of societal evolution. But when we are in the core, the heart of the piece, we have to play it for what it means to us, directly from the dead composer to us, through the hyphen of a teacher who perhaps give us a little bit to understand, hopefully more, imposes us a fingering, a pedaling, a harmonic hearing, a tempo, a phrasing, an organization that we can reject or accept in part or in all, We leave the room after the lesson, we forget half of it, or we record it and we listen to it and we still don't understand because the tip of the iceberg doesn't explain the whole iceberg under. It's only the result of it that you see on the tip. And that would be the analogy with the music experience that you bring in a recording that is rooted in all what you received, that you filtered, that you evolved in your understanding or misunderstanding of, and that you care enough to rework on it until you think you need to get closer to that, if not truth, your truth in the piece. And that I find very humbling when you see conductors re-record symphonies by Beethoven every so many years and give us the fruit of their understanding of little subtle innuendos. Where is a phrasing this way or that, and a dubbing of the sound there. But that is the case for most awareness of an art form. And when you're not aware of the art form, it just looks very factual or simple if it's figurative. And if it's not figurative, like paintings that are abstract, then you enter in your own, like when you read a book, imagination of what it could mean to you. But ultimately, when you play the piece, you're sort of a recitant of a text which was not yours, but which during the moment of delivery, you become the deliverer who, in the ears, eyes, and minds of the listeners, you are the piece, for good or bad. Especially when it's bad. It's not very fun. They say, oh, I messed up this, or I didn't do enough of that, or I intended to do this, and this transition didn't work, and the pedal went wrong, and why did I make a mistake where I usually never do, and the memory slip, and the nervousness on stage, and the instrument didn't respond the way I wanted, because I cannot carry my piano everywhere, etc., 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 etc. That's anecdotic. But it's fact of life, or facts of life, which bring us to find how we're going to reach to the heart of what it means to play the first movement of Beethoven Sonata Opus 110. The opening is a string quartet texture. And when one starts it, in order to make sure we keep the tempo that we will have through the piece, we have to look logically where we have more notes in the beat than one, which is 8 in the 30 seconds of the arpeggios. So if we think 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 6, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you can think like that, but then when you think like that, you don't hear the rising of steps, dropping by thirds, rising by fourths, in exchange of voice, which is his leitmotif for the subject of his fugue later in the sonata. And so you have to realize that in the recapitulation you have the 30 seconds, which are exposed in the exposition by themselves, and the thematic material of the theme in a string quartet setting in both hands together. But Beethoven chooses to do it only in the recapitulation, as if you put together the two elements and you give them to be understood after you present them separately, which makes them a little more in the opening when you don't know the piece, assumingly so in the narrative storytelling. As if you're wondering, discovering the tonality, the intervals, the four parts, and then the rhythms. You don't know that it's a dotted quarter, eighth note, dotted eighth note, 16th before you read it. But when you hear something and then something shorter and then something very short, then something else longer. So you could take it in dictation and sort of figure it out when you have trained your ear. But when you observe it, you realize that using the meter of 3/4 implies obviously 6/8 notes for each bar. But the subdivision in 2 times 3 or 3 times 2 makes the whole difference in the way you arch the pulse of the phrase. Give you an example. After the 4th bar, you have, and now from the string quartet, we switch to an aria. With a 16th note accompaniment for the 6/8 notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 3 times 2 by having the 16th notes by 3 groups of 4. And that's how they are placed on the score. So our eyes see it, therefore our brain is formatted to think, okay, 3, 4. But then the melody is dotted quarter, quarter, eighth. Each of the 3 notes of the rising arpeggio of the melodic line, first inversion of A flat major triad, are shorter. You start with a dotted quarter to have a quarter and an eighth note. So you realize that there is a delay after the second beat. You hear the second beat, and then you hear the second note in the melody. Third beat is played in the left hand, and only then you release at the very end, the last 6th, 8th note, the melody. So if you look at the melody, it's a dotted quarter, quarter, eighth, which is divided in this time 2 times 3 eighth notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 2 bars later, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 2 bars later, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But the left hand remains in 3/4, 3 times 2. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if Beethoven wanted to align the 2 hands, the melody and the accompaniment, to be structured in the pulse of the 3/4 meter rhythm, it would have been 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, if he used short long or short long short. 1, 2, but he doesn't. He does the 6/8. If I had to have the left hand accompaniment be in 6/8 eighth notes, I will have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3. So we have a 6/8 on 3/4. There are subtle innuendos of overlapping pulses between 2 dotted quarters over 3 quarters, so that they purposely not fully fit, but it's the way then the dotted quarter delaying the second note, and which delays the last eighth note in the first bar, creates a musical tension which the decay of the sound of the piano defeats. And what the left hand's accompaniment feeds by giving the illusion that you are feeding the tension as a vibrato. But in fact, it's so we have the illusion through the percussive instrument of the piano that we connect a tension-built arched phrase, when in fact, in terms of acoustics, it only drops as soon as it's played. Now, in Beethoven's time pianos, the decay was way earlier than ours. Of course, he couldn't know that for today. We can obviously relate to that, to the past. On top of this, he was deaf when he wrote these late sonatas. So that means that, in my opinion, and that's not only mine, he's walled in his own world and tries to say something from his inner voice, unfiltered by perhaps the outside world distraction, which is also beautiful because it can be seduction, it can be pleasant. After all, this is why it's to be shared. And when you hear to Beethoven pieces from his earlier period, they're charming, and that's not a belittling. But when you have these late sonatas, he goes to the essence of the language, of the melodic line. So I'm playing for you this phrase and I'm reading it at the same time. So what am I trying to do? I think I'm trying to take off from the score, keeping the elements in hand, and try to organize them by layered dynamic range and phrasing and imitation of voice in the right hand and accompaniment instrumental in the left hand, which by itself has a bass line which is melodic and a harmonization of the triads. And those repeated notes are very fast and short, so they're there to defeat decay. If not, you would lose the harmonization by the time you overlap this large volume of long values in the right hand. But in the opening theme, few bars earlier, you also have repeated notes in the melody. La, 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 re, si. So you wonder why music without lyrics needs repeated notes. Why not all melodize? Because on the piano, to give an example that just came to me, of semi-steps, or then a leap of third, is relatively close tones and you can legato them. But to legato a repeated note, you have to replay, and then you hear ta, 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 ta with a consonant and a vowel of the name of the note itself. In French, la, 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 solo, a, G. When the music has lyrics, then you can say, I would like to dance with you, this sonata. Anything silly you can think of. But the repeated notes have no more repeated because you change syllables or words. Therefore, you don't need to melodize everything. You can say several words on the same pitch. And without the lyrics, it's only the pitch left, and you have to repeat it on the piano. And then it's melodic. So it's melodic for when Beethoven writes the step motions, or he writes the repeated notes. And since he chose which are which and which are when and which are where, then you have to say, okay, what if I can make the repeated notes repeat within the resonance before the full lifting of the key? Ta, ha, 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 rather than, which would be ta, ta, ta. Of course, you can repeat them fully to make sure they speak because of the action of the piano, and then put the right foot pedal to create the connection. But in fact, by lifting the dampers, you only create more resonance instead of focusing the sound only on the four tones that you play. You lift and you hear harmonics, resonance of everything else. So you can play detached with legato by foot, right foot pedal, or you can try to play legato by finger control, by repeating it within the lifting of the key, even if it's risk-taking according to the different actions of instruments that respond more or less to it, to such a microscopic desire of control. so that you can do finger legato, nothing but to connect them without to restate them fully. Ta ha ha da. Like a vocalise rather than individual syllables. And then you have the middle notes that are repeated, which are the fillers of the harmony, which in orchestral symphonic writing of Beethoven are held by the horns. On the piano, he knows it will decay even if he was already deaf, but he knew from before. So he repeats it to make sure it's not left only to the two outer melodies, bass and soprano. So we have to be so aware when we start the piece, how we're going to choose the dynamic range, the colorization of the top line, the voice leading of the bass line. So once we're able to establish what kind of soundscape we are going to construct, then we have to understand what we want to do with those shorter repeated notes. Because the detail is in the fact that if you have a dotted rhythm, it means that the released note, which for a dotted eighth is a 16th, is stressed by essence, therefore shortened or narrower. And the dotted quarter into eighth note, the eighth note is shorter. If not, you would do. So obviously that's not what he wrote. And then if you delay the second to the second beat, and then the third into after the third beat, if you sing, you would make a possible vibrato, sustaining that dotted delay resolution and stressed shorter resolution. Ti-da, ti-da, ti-da. But you cannot make a vibrato on the piano once you've played a note. No matter what you try, it doesn't work. And Beethoven was aware that the piano is what it is, I mean the instrument, and he wrote a string quartet opening. He wrote an aria genre, and he wrote arpeggios, virtuosic, on the fortepiano harp style. So in the first page itself, you already have 3 genres for one thematic material that is presented separately before to be presented together in the recapitulation. And it's fascinating to observe how after this he has this expression into his early romanticism that's late in his life, where the expression builds up towards a climax which is denied. And that is something that one can spend decades in one's life to understand what he meant by that. Is it an avoided climax, or is it fragmented elements of imaginary orchestration with strings, woodwinds, not unaware of how they look, but of course that's not for me to mimic, is to hint it, for instance, by playing very fast the string section. And then this high-pitched, subito piano, molto legato section that follows quasi-statically what was a long build-up of 30 seconds, like a tremolo of strings, which in fact makes you not hear the top note because you hear the resonance or what was before it, unless you doctor then the score and you start thinking, in order to make sure people can hear, or I can hear, or one should want to hear the first note of this new section that comes abruptly, dynamically dropped from the build-up of the crescendo of the articulation of the 30 seconds prior to it, that the resonance of it won't overlap the first note. But perhaps that's what he meant. And if I delay it, it's just a way to say, I'm going to make it more understood, because it disturbs me that it's covered. Perhaps he would have liked that we do that. Perhaps he didn't feel like having to notate this little minute indication. Or perhaps the structure of the pulse of the group of bars doesn't call for it, and that's where the example of the symphonies of Beethoven are so obvious. When you see that happen, the person who would play, let's say, the flute, is counting the rests for 3 beats while the orchestra strings players are playing the 30 seconds, and then they enter and they play beautifully, piano, whatever they're supposed to play. So the listener hears a color change evolving from one, let's say, group of instruments like the strings, if it were, to a flute playing the melodic line, and you hear the difference of volume but also of color or timbre. On the piano, you lose it. And so therefore, if you play all the parts in the piano, you don't count rest to enter later, you play and the before and the after, and therefore you start as a pianist with your brain thinking linearly, oh, this is leading me to a climax. And because he denies it, then you try to think, perhaps I should lead into it. As if to lessen the surprise of the unexpected drop. When few bars later he has another build-up with trill in the left hand and arpeggio in the right hand, there he has not only a crescendo but a sforzando on the high note that he reaches, which is the B flat. But earlier in those 30 seconds, we had these lighted notes, but they were denied the arrival point of the climax. So he contrasts something driven with something very dreamy or daydreaming. And when he doesn't, then he reaches the from fourth piano to forte with a sforzando. And the conclusion of the exposition, he has groups by 2 phrased in the right hand, in the left hand 2. Just that the release of the one is the tension of the other if you take the 2 parts top and bottom without the harmonic filling. And nothing but this choice of opposites, of opposition of phrasings, of tension and releases, of rising and dropping voices. Okay, all this can be described and said as I do, but how is it played? Either one hand overtakes the other, and it's all for the right hand, either left hand. But if they are both, then you can feel that tension, that almost magnetic contraction or reaction. I find it very easy to go in details, as we do when we study it, because that's what we learn. How will we finger? And then we have this scale that is 1 tetrachord is in the tonality, then two of them are chromatic, and then one is in tonality. So it's sort of hybrid, more chromatic or tonal. And then we have to make a crescendo according to the notation of his example. And the diminuendo is placed in the addition of the last 4/30 seconds, which in real time corresponds to almost a subito. So do we delay and do we decide? We have to decide how much is the crescendo in order to drop into the piano back. Is it going to rise to a mezzo piano, forte, and then drop to what we would define piano or mezzo piano? We make the gauges and we make the the exaggerations of the hint, because in a way there's hint there of a crescendo. And you can spend a lifetime searching to understand how you integrate this within the repeated notes of before, the trills from before, the arpeggios that were there, and then how you're going to organize these apparent fragmentations of the thoughts, which is very modern even for his time, at least for ours, compared to a structured organization of 4x4 bars of a thought process. And you have this probably fleeing thoughts that are at several levels appearing and then disappearing, and others coming out. And when you play it alone, you try to think that each one leads to each other. And then you go, how will I tie it all? How will I make it be? Was it a quilt? Is it a single wave? Is it a thought that evolves into different aspects but continues to be the same? Or is it a desire to reach some culmination which first is denied, then is reached, then I have a drop? And then all of a sudden, the hardest probably of all these expressions that I try to define, how much is too much, not enough, or hint or an exaggeration of, is all these 4 bars of conclusion in the tonality of E flat major, the dominant, where it's calm, flat, no expression of sense in the sense of hairpin. I cannot tell you how long that is for a student, let less for me. We are all students in front of this piece at all seasons of our lives. But that's obvious, goes without to say, when we are so driven into what it can mean to us and to humanity. Well, it's possible to manage how much you rise a crescendo or drop a diminuendo, how early or how subito. But when you have to play this non-moving harmony, non-expressive hair rising of anything or dropping, it's not that it's flat, it's just that it's appeased. And to be able to find the right proportions to express so many fragments of expression that are hinted, interrupted, replaced by others, and going, in fact, in its continuity relatively rapidly, you have to have in mind constantly the construction of where it leads you and through where you go, and how you manage these details, which individually are essential, but put in the context have to find their own placement in dynamics, in tempo, in phrasing, in volume, of course, in articulation, in touch, and in the pedaling. For instance, the opening 30 seconds, Beethoven or the publisher writes the dot on the first of the 430 seconds. So the harmonization can be played finger legato, as I call it, when you, well, many people call it. It just happens that I'm saying it, rather. Where the fingers hold the harmony by overlapping, and then the staccati are the markers of the half beats, like a pizzicato if it was an imaginary instrument. And if you put pedal, then you should put it into the harmonization, the second, third, and fourth 32nd, not on the beats. Because then the staccato will overstay. And if you put it in between, then it only overlaps the resonance of itself, not necessarily the pedaled one, and you signal that these are the beats and the rest are the harmonizations. So if you play the pedal very short and in the middle of each of the eighth notes, you preserve the staccato. And then you hear the left hand doing these chords, and you realize that if they were rhythmized, like the opening 3 repeated chords we saw earlier, there would be, and you feel like there is another way of him hinting at the first theme through the arpeggios, which represent that, and then, or not rhythmized, in the left hand. It's a fascinating exploration of a simple melodic pattern with harmonization, and how he nuclearly breaks it into so many different aspects where you find pieces of it connected or disconnected or flying away from it. And probably that's one of the reasons, most likely other, for which we have difficulty focusing on what to bring out or what to less bring out, because in fact everything is meaningful. We have to be our own orchestra with different timbres in imagination that we hint through the voicing of the shadows and lights. Good luck to that. There are so many more than the fingers and the capacity to control, but to imagine, yeah, then you control what you can from the imagination. To give you an example, in the development, when he starts in F minor, he starts exactly with the texture of the aria. And what does he do to make it more interesting? He makes a dialogue of the celli in the bass, if it were in the left hand, where the rising scale is without hairpin. The answer it on the dominant has a hairpin, but to which extent, again, it's up to us. But there is a dialogue between and modulating from F minor to D flat major to B flat minor to go back to the dominant of A flat and return at the recap. But that is not it. What is mainly there is the melody. Which is the theme. But we could be distracted by these scales and arpeggios in answer to each other in the left hand. Up stems, lower stems. And of Of course, the fast 16th notes take more of the narrative space because they don't decay as much because they're faster values, shorter values. And the melodic line that stays in long values decays. So in order to hear the top prevail thematically and the accompaniment that is so rich in this dialogue of the left-hand basses has to be as expressive as under, while in its own layered level. It's one after the other. It's the same at the same time. It's a structure of 8 bars instead of 2 and 2 and 2. Is something where you don't want to think in alternation, but you want to think the layers of these distractions, because he could have very well gone into an accompaniment like in the beginning of it and do... And so this beautiful, elaborate dialogue of scales and arpeggios in the left hand are so overwhelmingly interesting to follow and to bring out, and to which level, that you have to still follow thematically the meaning of the decaying long values rhythmically of the theme. So it's easier to just erase the left hand and just focus on the right hand, or then you bring the left hand to the point to which you erase the right hand, because you have to find the way to bring out both in their own individual length of sound and decays and expression, regardless of their thematic hierarchy between what is accompaniment and what is not. And when he returns to the recapitulation, you get finally to hear the 30 seconds of the opening after the empty string quartet quarter notes to the filled quarter notes by the 30 seconds. And this, you only hear it by the time you get to that point. And then comes the famous flat 6 situation I mentioned earlier. So what is flat 6 in A flat major is F flat major, but that's difficult to read in this forest of flats and double flats, so that Beethoven inharmonically misspells it in E major. And when we reach the end of that section, which is only a few bars, and he wants to go back to A flat major with the 4 flats this time, and the key signature is changed. We have G sharp G, G A flat. The spelling is unnecessarily complicated or unnecessarily confusing. What you obtain is an effect. What is a Neapolitan 6 is a darker harmonization of major. What is a flat 6 is to have a minor 6 with a major third. It's a half major, half minor smile with a tear. So you have some kind of major with a minor hug inside the fifth, which could be, in more musicological terms than a hug, be something like lesser major, or some kind of sunset major. And therefore the whole section of 8 bars going back to A flat major, when we reach the end, he has in the last bars that F flat melodically is an appoggiatura to the 5th, the flat 6 melodically this time, not as a harmony, not in minor, nor all major, nor all minor, but just minor for the flat 6 and the major third. not to mention the connection with the that is hinted in the Allegro molto F minor starting with the same third, because it's obviously two common tones out of three. And then with the rests, you can organize the last two bars of 3/4 into one of 3/2, and then each of the half notes of the 3/2 becomes the whole note of the next movement. So you have 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3, which becomes 1, 2, 3, 4. Perhaps it's pushing it to try to find that pulse transition and understand why he finishes unconclusively for us, or for some of us, by open-ended. That we do or we don't organize it in that way for the transition, the fact that we stay suspended in an expectation of something that we just don't want to leave, and we start, by itself, it's already a hint that perhaps the first movement of 110, like the first movement of 109, and the prestissimo are two parts of one slow, fast construction of a movement. Could you call it sections, or you perhaps separate movements? In the notation, the simple 2 bars, or the one with the thicker ending, second bar for conclusive ending, but then the music doesn't conclude. I think that is probably one of the reasons for which many people find very difficult to find how to define what they are reading, hearing, and when they are playing it, because Beethoven explores, hints at things that he doesn't complete, that stay in us for an perhaps development of the thought beyond the piece. I give you an example in the last pages. Which is the same at the conclusion we had earlier in the dominant, when he's appeased and nothing is going on in terms of harmony or expression of hairpin. And at the end of this, he has these and finishes with the arpeggios that we had in the beginning of 30 seconds. So all of a sudden he interrupts. He does that in 109. When until there he had a flow of 16th notes. And here we have 30 seconds, 16th notes. We have a flow of notes, and all of a sudden we interrupt. And they're repeated, most possibly likely, but not for sure, other than aesthetically, for decaying denial, and have it last two and a half beats. Orchestrally, that could be very well woodwinds or even strings, regardless, but they wouldn't decay. And it's inserted between the 16ths. And then it's interrupted to go back to 30 seconds through this. So this kind of enigmatic, possibly understood by some, but to me still very interesting to approach as a succession of fragmented thoughts, which by the elemental fact of the rising steps by fourths in dropping thirds, elementally you find everywhere into the fugue at the end. And therefore these different expressions of different elements appear to be non-connecting, and if we try to connect them as a meaningful flow of things, we find ourselves in a dead end, because he has a crescendo to nowhere, or he has a crescendo to an arrival which then doesn't conclude anywhere and stays in suspension. A bit like the verb at the end of the syntax in German language. It leaves you to wait, expect, and perhaps not know if the action is present, future, or past. And so there is a sense of expectation that is so developed later in this Romantic era, that Beethoven sort of opens the door of by Schumann, to be in this expectation. It's not only attention for a release; it's a longing forward. And always in Beethoven, you see repeated notes, step motion, you see simple arpeggios or simple elements that you can say, they're so mundane, so pedestrian. How can I have something so elevated, philosophical, thought-provoking, introspective, making me spend my life in the choice of the notes that hint to other things that I want to, if not harness, try to imagine, because somehow a choice of a poetic word hints to an innuendo that is not developed, that jumps on another. And if you only know the meaning, you don't understand, because you can do a translation, but a poem is also a language by the sounds of the music of the words. And so is the same with the tonality. What is A flat major? And how you organize the intervals and the steps and the semi-steps. And he manages to make something so incredibly thought-provoking and bringing us immediately to a deep sense of reflection with elements that are very banal. And you go, okay, so then how will I be able to bring this, how will I elevate myself through my playing to his thoughts through these elements, which also are simple because they lace the whole piece together. Perhaps invisibly, perhaps visibly. And the more you try to make sense of it, the least it makes sense to make sense of it, because that's probably not the purpose. It's a statement of a state of mind that leads us to a section to another, and then we might find correspondences between and we say, oh, I hint there, I heard that, and this, and this. And then I think it's great food for thought, as well as to get almost lost in daydreaming, escapism, because one enters in levels that one cannot describe. Which I gauchely tried, most likely failed. Thank you.